Hi, 1010 Music just released a new Mark II hardware version of Bitbox and a new mini-me version of it, Bitbox Micro, two of the most powerful and flexible Eurorack samplers, sample players, and loopers. How usable are they? In this video we'll take a look at what they can do in detail, then look at the differences between them as well as pros and cons for each. Before I start, I wanted to stress test what they can do, so I loaded up a project I prepared for the Keystep Pro review I made a couple of weeks ago with drums, bass, pads, lead parts, and tried to run everything through Bitbox Micro, and with some limitations I'll discuss, it actually worked quite well. So what you heard in the beginning of this video was all sequenced by Keystep Pro, all played by Bitbox Micro. Bitbox Mark II can obviously do much more, and when you put everything together in this pattern, everything is playing back through the pads on Bitbox Micro in this case. Just so you understand what's going on, this is a 4-track sequence, so track 1 is the drums. Okay, triggered in these 5 pads over here. Track 2 is a multi-sampled bass instrument. Track 3 is a very interesting multi-sampled instrument. I'll show you how I did it later on. It's basically a piano and a synth layer that I made in my DAW and then multi-sampled into here. And then track 4 is this lead playing on pad 8 with some internal reverb here. Now everything is sent through via MIDI, through this MIDI cable. Obviously you can use both with control voltage, and we'll talk about the differences between the two in that respect as well. Okay, let's start with the main differences. Even though both are powered by the same processor behind the scenes, and there are many similar features, which we'll look at in detail, there are quite a few important differences. The biggest differences are obviously size, price, number of jacks, and number of pads or sample slots. If you don't mind, by the way, I'll call them Bitbox and Micro, not Bitbox Mark II and Bitbox Micro. Anyway, Bitbox is 26 HP wide and Micro is 18 HP. Bitbox costs $600 and Micro costs $400. Bitbox supports 16 sample pads or slots per preset or project, and Micro supports only 8 individual pads. On both, by the way, you can store as many presets or groups of pads as your SD card will allow. Let's take a look at the I/O. On the input and output side, you might think Bitbox wins with a knockout with 28 jacks compared to 18 on Micro, and indeed, on the input side, Bitbox has a clear lead, but on the output side, Micro puts up a nice fight with 6 assignable audio outputs alongside a master pair, compared with only 4 assignable outputs on Bitbox. So if separate processing is important to you further down the line with external effects or modular effects, Micro has the lead. Both have a MIDI input, but only Micro has a MIDI output. Now, neither of these, at least not in the current firmware, is a sequencer, so MIDI output doesn't matter that much for sequencing. It's mainly used here for multisampling, which I'll show you later on, as well as for sending clock out. Kudos to 1010 Music, by the way. Both MIDI inputs accept both MIDI A and MIDI B, TRS-A and TRS-B, these 3.5mm jacks. It comes with a dongle, and the MIDI output here is TRS-B. Another slight advantage that Micro has over Bitbox is that it has 4 inputs capable of high bitrate audio, whereas Bitbox only has 2, these 2 guys here. That's why it's marked in A and in B here, but currently inputs 3 and 4 aren't used for audio, so they're equal as of the current firmware versions. These extra inputs may be more precise for volt per octave control of notes. I haven't really stress tested both in this respect. Anyway, so these nice advantages for Micro are there, but overall on the input side, Bitbox has the lead with dedicated gate inputs for each of the pads, 4 modulation inputs, and these 2 can be used for modulation as well, whereas Micro has 8 input jacks in total that need to be shared for triggering the pads, for clock if you need it, or for modulation, for control voltage modulation. So whereas these inputs are shared, these are mostly dedicated. There are some shared inputs. For example, this column can be used both for external modulation and for triggering pads. And like I mentioned earlier, these two inputs can be used either for audio input or as additional control voltage inputs for modulation. You control what these inputs do on the tools page right here, the second tools page. So for example, here I've got these two set to audio, these 5 set to gate, and this set to clock. Changing them is pretty easy. You just turn this knob to choose the different options. These can be used, by the way, as gate, CV, or clock inputs. You really only want to use one of these for clock. Now, you're not obligated to send the modules clock. You certainly don't need that for triggering samples or, for just playing them. But if you play loops, so let's just take this, for example, and you want to sync the tempo of these loops to external tempo, then you can send the modules clock and then, let's say, go into here. As you change the clock, the loops will be sped up or slow down. And both support time stretch, which we'll discuss later on. Anyway. Okay, let's move on to the next obvious difference between the two modules, and that's the touch screen size, the additional knobs, and the parameter editing workflow. The bigger 3.5-inch screen on Bitbox is obviously more convenient to work with compared to Micro's 2-inch screen, but I have to say, personally, screen size isn't what I'd base my decision on here. The 2-inch screen doesn't feel too limiting or cramped when you're actually using it, and not comparing it to this one. Both touch screens are very responsive, by the way, and there aren't that many functions that require fine precision using the touchscreen. If you plan to trigger the pads using the screen, obviously a bigger screen is better, but because this layout is 5x4 as opposed to 4x4, the actual pads aren't that much bigger on Bitbox compared to Micro. The workflow itself of editing a pad is slightly different. So once you select a pad by touching it or by using the knobs to select a pad, you drill into a pad by pressing Info here and the right key here, in which case you'll see a visual representation of the sample. The touchscreen really is only used for pinching and zooming your way across the samples. Selecting start and end points are done using the knobs anyway, so the fine control obviously is more limited here, but isn't that limiting when you actually go ahead and edit samples. Editing the sample playback parameters themselves, however, is more convenient on Bitbox. So if you want to drill into the playback parameters, you press Info again here and the right button here. On Bitbox, each of the knobs controls the individual parameter you see on screen, and you have different tabs to tab between the different parameters. On Micro, all the parameters are in a single list. You move up and down the list using the top knob, and you change a parameter using the bottom knob. So it's obviously more convenient to have direct control over 4 parameters at a time on Bitbox compared to changing parameters on Micro, where you first need to find the parameter and then edit its value. By the way, for those of you concerned about menu diving, I know this list sometimes seems overwhelming, especially if it's the first time you see it, but in fact, these are just options that you can choose to use or not when playing back a sample. So you can trigger samples to your heart's content without ever entering these menus, but at some point you're going to say, oh, I wish I could do this thing or that, loop a sample, and so on, and that's exactly what these 20 or so parameters represent. Now, these parameters are actually pretty similar between the two modules. I'll go over them in detail in a bit, but let's go back to the home screen and look at a few more differences and similarities. This is the main screen on Bitbox, though you'll probably be in the pads view most of the time. This is home on Bitbox Micro. You can see the 8 pads here and have access to loading up additional presets here if you like. Even though it seems like there are 6 options here and fewer options here, it's actually the same on both. If you press Tools, you've got access to overall global parameters. Same parameters as you see here. Same deal as we saw before, though. There are tabs here with direct access to 4 parameters at a time, as opposed to just scrolling through a list over here. There is a master compressor, by the way, on both. I prefer to turn it off. It's better if you're playing polyphonically on multiple tracks, but you might find it useful if you're just playing percussive samples. I won't go over all the options. There's an option to flip the UI here if you want to place the module upside down on your rack. The other ones are pretty straightforward. Let's go back to the home screen. Once you select a pad, let's say this one, you can play it with onboard keys if you like. Up and down octaves. Obviously, this is a very small screen. Same option exists here, by the way, as well. And there's also a scaled keys option on both. Both let you choose the key and the scale you want to play in. Obviously, it's more convenient to play on the bigger screen than it is on the smaller one. Both have the same mixing and effects capabilities. So if I head out to the main screen, that's a mix over here and just another press over here. So I'll just show this over here. Both let you control the level, and let's just get this back to normal. Panning of each of the pads, and if you hit next here, you can also mute pads. So let's maybe go into this scene where we've got more going on. So I can choose to mute pads. Same over here, by the way. Same exact deal. And then both have an effects send page. So let's not leave Bitbox out here. Let's go back here and just start a few pads going. So let's say, for example, I wanted to apply reverb to the snare. There's a delay as well. And you can edit the effects parameters by pressing info here. These are the delay parameters. These are the reverb parameters. And let's just stop this. Same exact deal over here. Choose the pad, choose the reverb or delay sends, and then choose the effect and edit its parameters. So home here cycles between playing the pads, the mixer, and the effects, and here it's just different windows you can choose. Okay, so up until now I've been mostly covering differences between the two. Now let's take a look at their sampling or sample playback powers, which is quite similar in both modules. Let's maybe do this over here. I'll start up with a new preset, and you've got an onboard keyboard here to type in preset names, so that's pretty convenient and responsive. On Micro, they didn't include a keyboard, which makes sense. It's pretty small. So if you want to start a new preset, you'll need to sort of move between the letters and, do this thing to name projects. Let's just cancel that. Anyway, let's dive into this. Go into pads. Pads are empty by default. 16 here, 8 here, and you just select a pad. Go into info, which is right key here, and then either record and sample directly into the device or load up a sample from the SD card. You can navigate the entire SD card as you wish. Let's just say go into here and load up anything. You can also press play to listen to a preview of the samples. Let's go with this one. And like I mentioned earlier, hit info and you can start editing the sample parameters. So here, this is my snare over here. You've got a few controls. Overall level, a filter, both low pass, no resonance control, but goes from low pass to a high pass, same here, by the way. And you can pitch a sample up or down. Maybe for a snare, it doesn't sound that appropriate, but you can set the bass offset. There are a few launch modes. Trigger will just trigger the sample. You've got gate mode, which will keep it open for as long as you hold the key down, and then you have an ADSR envelope to control what happens as long as gate is pressed and then after you release the gate. And there's a toggle option as well, which is cool to just get loops going or samples going and move ahead to something else. You can choose which of the outputs the sample goes out through. Like I mentioned, there are 6 individual outputs, and samples can be either stereo or mono. You can choose any one of the outputs. The master outputs will always output everything. Everything that's available here is available here, with the obvious differences. So here you've got 6 outputs, here you've got 4. Next up, you can choose between mono playback or polyphonic playback. Pretty straightforward. You don't need polyphonic playback on percussive instruments typically, so that will save on the voice count. I mentioned ADSR control previously. You can have choke groups if you want, 4 choke groups. This is a higher quality playback if you want that. And you can choose whether a sample will loop or not. It depends on your trigger mode. So let's put this on gate. So now as long as I keep a key pressed down, it'll keep looping. You can go back and see that here. Set start and end points and loop points for the sample. Okay. There's a granular mode, which we'll talk about later, but you can get pretty granular with this as well. Anyway, let's keep going down the parameters. Loop starts and loop points. MIDI control, so you can choose whether a dedicated MIDI channel will trigger this sample melodically. In this case, I don't want that to happen because I'm triggering all the percussive elements of this particular project individually using one MIDI channel. And you can also set the pad note if you like. If you want a different note to trigger the pad. That's basically it. These are the options for normal sample playback, and you can see the same exact options here as well. So that's pretty much it for normal sample playback. There are a few additional sample playback options: clip, slicer, and granular, and of course that's available on both. The point behind clip sample playback is what we've been seeing before here on Bitbox, which is this grid which lets you launch loops. Let's maybe load back the original. Which one was I showing? I think it's this one. So all these samples are in clip mode, which means that you can launch them as clips. Like I mentioned before, you can time stretch them, make them run either faster or slower if clock is coming in. And there's no way to set the tempo currently, which is a bit odd. Hopefully they'll add that feature. But if you are running clips, you will want to send it external tempo or external clock. I showed you a bit of the time stretch algorithm earlier. It works okay. It works better, obviously, when you make loops faster compared to making them slower. And so making things go fast is always easier algorithmically. Going slower is a bit choppier and more difficult. Stopping external clock, by the way, doesn't stop the pads. There isn't a stop pad function, so you'll need to stop them either manually or with control voltage or with gates into the inputs. Clip launching obviously works on Bitbox Micro as well. Let's maybe load up the same project. I did want to show you something here. So let's go again for the same one. Obviously fewer pads here. Right, only 8 pads or 8 simultaneous loops here compared to 16 over here. Anyway, what I wanted to show you here is you can use both modules to live loop. So I've got a computer here off screen, and I'll plug into these inputs. Don't forget that when you want to sample, you'll need to go into Tools and change these two inputs to function as audio inputs. So I've got another keyboard here. This is plugged into my computer, so I can play notes into this and record them here off my computer. Let's just put this down here carefully. Anyway, I could go ahead and sample this just as a straight out sample, but if I set it, say, to a quantized length of, let's say, 2 bars, and I do set recording quantization to 1 bar to keep things simple, go ahead, get maybe just the kick and snare going. And then this is my attempt at live looping here, very simply. Just hit record. I said it's 2 bars, so I'm going to get 2 bars. And I just live looped into this slot. And yeah, this is the sample. I could obviously go ahead and edit it. But my point here was that time-synced looping is pretty simple and straightforward on both modules. Let's move on to the next pad type. Let me just move these guys out. So if I go into my recording here, it's set to clip currently, which means it'll automatically loop and stay synced to any external clock. Let's check out slicer mode. You load up a sample and you can go ahead and chop it up in here. You can set slice points manually just by choosing a point and hitting the split button. So now I've got 2 splices, and you can set as many split points as you want. You can also join parts back into one large sample. Here we go. Join. There we go. And then you can also scan using threshold detection. You can see it detected these 4 hits pretty nicely. Then there are a few ways you can handle these. You can play them as notes up and down the keyboard. You can modulate the slice point if you like. I'll talk about modulation later on, but that is a modulatable destination. And there are also a few options to play through slices sequentially, either forwards, backwards, randomly, or staggering backwards and forward motion. Anyway, the last major mode before I talk about multisampling is granular mode. Now I can hit play, the sample will play its course, and I could then set loop points, kind of like I did before. Only with a granular looper, you have a few additional options, like grain size and grain count. So it's, you know, a nice option to play with. Grain spread. And you can, of course, also modulate the start length and end points. Anyway, that's the granular synth here. It's monophonic, by the way, on a per pad basis. Let's move on to one of my favorite features here. I think I mentioned this. That's the multi-sampling. I'll pick an empty pad, then dive into it. And if you hit here, this 1x button, and go into multi, it'll get into multi-sample recording mode. Now for this, I need to bring in my audio source again. So let's get these cables back in here. Both Bitboxes support playing back and creating multi-samples from the device itself. In case you're not familiar with what multi-samples are, they're a great way to create natural samples of melodic instruments like pianos, violins, guitars. So let me explain why this is important. Samplers are great at playing back what they record. But if you want to pitch a sample up or down, play it melodically, samplers will just take that same sample, because they don't have anything else, and either play it faster or slower to change its pitch. And the result sounds increasingly unnatural the farther away you pitch up or down a sample from its original pitch. The way to create a sample of an instrument that plays nicely across a large range of octaves is ideally to sample every single semitone up and down the keyboard. Also, since many instruments, especially acoustic ones, sound differently whether you play them louder or not, to get a realistic sounding virtual instrument, it's not enough that you just play the sample louder as you increase playback velocity. Ideally, you'll sample a broad range of velocities per note of the original instrument. Now, both Bitboxes support playback of multi-sample instruments with different samples for different velocities and across the octave range. But if you use the MIDI output of Bitbox Micro, you can also sample different velocities. So in this case, I've got a TRS MIDI cable going out, Micro's MIDI out, sent to my computer playing Una Corda by Native Instruments. This is a really nice piano. And it also sounds very differently whether you play it louder or not. Now to multi-sample, you'll obviously want to set a name which is relevant to the sample, not SL trans, hopefully. Let's just call this. And it'll put all these samples in a directory in your preset. Then you can choose whether you want to sample in stereo or not. You can, by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, resample audio from the instrument itself, whether you're looping or recording samples. Anyway, let's go for stereo. You choose the note range. Let's stick with C2 to C6 here. Then you choose the pitch interval between the samples. In a perfect world, you'd sample every semitone. I think there's a limit to how many samples this supports. I'll just choose every 6 semitones. Then you choose the number of velocity layers. Ideally, more is better than fewer. It'll take longer the more you choose. Let's maybe go with 4 here. Note length, this is a piano sound, so let's not go for too long. Again, ideally 5, but let's go with 3 because I want to keep this short, 3 seconds. And then release length, let's keep this short as well to 2 seconds. And that's pretty much it. You just hit record and it will start the sampling process. You're not hearing, by the way, this first note because it's at a very low level. It starts with the lowest velocity. This can take a while, so I'll speed up through it. Yeah, that's pretty much it. We can clear these guys out again. Lesson learned for next time, by the way, is that I can use a much shorter tail. And I want this to work in gate mode, ideally. And let's just stick with these settings. Let's see how it sounds. It's so very natural sounding across the keyboard. And for extra credit for you to try at home, if I go back to my original project. So this sound is a piano and synth layered in my computer, triggered at the same time via MIDI, then recorded, multi-sampled back into here. And the result can be, I think, pretty nice. It can bring really interesting sounds into a modular environment. Next up, I know I'm going to get asked this question. Yes, both modules can do phased loops, meaning different length loops that repeat and create ambient and evolving textures. Julia Gjersten kindly sent me a few loops. I'll link to her music below. These are the originals. And I transposed them to hopefully match each other, and I also set them to loop endlessly. And if you're into this kind of music, you can spend quite a bit of time messing with these loops here. I panned these two separately, left and right, and go into the mix here. Bring this one in. Set the level for this before I bring it in. Gradually bring it in. You can send these out for separate processing, of course, if you wanted. Bring things in and out at will. This could go on forever. I'll play a little bit more of it at the end of this video. For now, we need to move on. Alright, aside from all the fancy sampling options these modules have, they also support modulation of quite a few of their parameters. There's no global mod matrix, which would have been nice, but rather you can tell if a parameter can serve as a modulation destination. If I say drill into the parameter list, if it has these black boxes under its name on Bitbox, or if I drill into here, if it has these black dots to the right of its name. So let's say that I wanted to modulate the filter here. I would press one of these 3 black boxes. You can have 3 sources feeding into it, then choose the source over here and the mod depth. Same goes here. So let's say that I wanted to modulate the filter here. Hit right over here, choose one of the 3 sources. Let's say pick the first one. I can choose any one of the external inputs. And then there are a few MIDI options to pick from, as well as MIDI CC. And you can just apply MIDI CC using the learn function. So if I just hit learn, then turn a knob, then this knob would control the filter. As I mentioned earlier, there are 4 sources here that are dedicated, then external 5 through 8 is this column. There's in 1 and in 2 for audio here, and all the MIDI sources here as well. Like I mentioned here with Micro, if you want to control parameters with control voltage, you'll need to give up gate inputs or audio inputs in favor of control voltage. As we head into the pros and cons, a final word about 2 substantial features of the original Bitbox that 1010 Music have announced will be coming to Bitbox Mark II, but aren't available as of the making of this video, and that's support for the FXbox and Synthbox firmwares. In a nutshell, the Synthbox firmware turns Bitbox into a wavetable synth, and FXbox turns it into an effects machine. I've covered both of these. I'll link to that review below. Currently, 1010 Music isn't planning to port these additional firmwares over to Micro, so as of the making of this video, that's an advantage Bitbox Mark II has that Micro doesn't. Aside from that, let's take a look at additional pros and cons of these 2 modules. You'd think that the biggest cons for Micro are the smaller screen and the fact that it only has 8 pads and not 16. Now, while obviously more pads and a bigger screen matter, personally I think what you might find most disadvantageous in a modular environment is the fact that Micro only has 8 inputs that you need to share for triggering pads, clock, and control voltage. So to make the most of Micro, it helps if you have MIDI facilities in your rack or next to it. MIDI completely opens up Micro, and if you have a small Eurorack case, and even smaller than this one, Micro gives other non-Eurorack samplers a run for their money solely based on its features with MIDI connectivity. But if you look at your modular setup strictly as based on control voltage, I think that Bitbox Mark II would work better for you. It is obviously more expensive though. Like I mentioned earlier, Micro does have an edge when it comes to multisampling, which I think is a very important feature here. It has MIDI out, whereas Bitbox Mark II does not. And even though Bitbox can multisample with control voltage, it doesn't support velocity layers, at least not in the current firmware, whereas Micro does. So if you want to take a lot of virtual instruments from your computer on the go into your modular system, or even into a small non-modular system with a small case, this is ideal. Other cons you might want to take note of: while the official polyphony count for both is 24, if you use crossfades when you loop samples, the count drops dramatically. So my advice is, if you can, just create longer samples as opposed to counting on crossfades and loops, say for creating sustained notes. I mentioned earlier, both can load up huge sample files from your SD card and stream them, but if you plan to load up large files or stems and edit them here, there's a limit to how much you can pinch and zoom out on very large samples. So moving across those samples can be difficult and would be better done on a computer. But you absolutely can bring long tracks and even stems into both of these and use that alongside whatever else you have going on, which is a huge plus. So those are the cons that I encountered while trying these out. On the pros side, if you want sampling, looping, to bring in any instrument you like into your rack through multisampling, or just simple long-form audio playback, like I mentioned for stems, or just in the background, with what I think is a very easy to use interface once you get used to it, you can't go wrong with either one of these. With some Eurorack samplers, I sometimes feel like there's a wall between me and the samples, and here, for the most part, it certainly feels like you can just reach out and touch and edit samples quite easily, making them very, very malleable. And if you want a whole bunch of ideas on what to do with samplers and their modulatable parameters, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Feel free to ask me anything in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.